наступил великий день победы над Германией.
On the evening of February 28th, 1953, Joseph Stalin, one of history's most feared dictators, sat down for what seemed like another ordinary night of food, drink, and conversation with his inner circle.
Великий жертвы, принесенные нами во имя свободы и независимости нашей Родины.
Within hours, he would be lying on the floor of his private dacha, paralyzed and gasping for breath.
Но я надеюсь, что Красной Армии удастся.
Over the next 24 hours, silence, fear, and suspicion filled his guarded estate as his staff and closest allies debated whether to call for help. In this video, we'll walk hour by hour through the final day of Stalin's life. The final evening of Joseph Stalin's life began like so many before it, in the confines of his heavily guarded Kuntsevo dacha on the outskirts of Moscow. By 9 p.m., the familiar faces of his inner circle had arrived. Lavrenti Beria, Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikolai Bulganin. These were men who owed their positions, and indeed their survival. Men who laughed when he laughed and feared every sudden shift in his mood. Their attendance was not optional. To refuse a dinner invitation from Stalin was to invite suspicion, and suspicion often ended in a prison cell or a bullet. That night, as was customary, Stalin began with a film in his private screening room. He had long loved cinema, often arranging special showings of Soviet productions or even foreign films smuggled in. Yet the real performance was not on the screen, but in the audience. Khrushchev later recalled how everyone waited for Stalin's reaction before daring to laugh or comment. When Stalin chuckled, so did they. For the men in that room, surviving a film with Stalin was as much about political theater as it was about entertainment. After the showing, the group moved to the dining table laid out for a midnight feast. Stalin was in an uncharacteristically genial mood. He teased Khrushchev, poking his belly and calling him Mykola, a friendly Ukrainian nickname that disarmed even the usually guarded Khrushchev. But the shadow of Stalin's paranoia never left the table. Between toasts, he asked pointed questions about preparations for the upcoming trial of the doctors arrested in Moscow, the so-called doctor's plot. He spoke of conspiracies and traitors, weaving suspicion into the evening as easily as pouring wine. The others nodded, agreed, and raised their glasses. The clock ticked past midnight, but Stalin was in no rush. The atmosphere was deceptively warm, even jovial. Yet beneath the laughter lay a shared unease, the knowledge that these gatherings did not always end so pleasantly. On this night, however, Stalin's good humor endured. The feast carried on into the early hours, the men drinking deeply, their laughter echoing through the dacha's guarded halls. They could not know that these would be the last carefree moments before history took a grim and irreversible turn. By the time the long hand reached 2, the men were glassy-eyed, their faces flushed with drink. Malenkov leaned heavily on his elbow, while Bulganin tried to keep his posture straight, their survival dependent on matching Stalin's mood until he chose to release them. At 3, the room grew quieter, but Stalin remained relentless, lifting his glass again and again, retelling stories, mocking his subordinates with the same mixture of humor and menace that kept them constantly off balance. By 4, exhaustion made the room sluggish, but still the dictator pushed his guests onward, unwilling to end the night. It was not until the first hints of dawn glowed faintly beyond the snow-laden forest that Stalin finally relented. At 5 in the morning, he rose, smiling broadly, and waved them off. His good mood carried to the end, a rarity that left his companions quietly relieved as they stumbled into the cold dark. Stalin, for the last time in his life, walked alone to his quarters, leaving behind a house that would soon fall into an unnatural silence. When the sun rose over Moscow on March 1st, Stalin, who had retired just as dawn broke, gave no sign of stirring. By 10 a.m., his staff waited for the familiar sound of a bell or a call to bring tea, but the hours passed with nothing. Normally, even after long nights, the Generalissimo would eventually summon food or a secretary. Now the silence stretched longer than anyone could remember. Servants whispered in the hallways, exchanging anxious glances. Some suggested knocking, but fear held them back. Stalin had made it clear many times before he was never to be disturbed. One wrong move, one intrusion at the wrong moment could mean exile or worse, and so they waited. Noon came and went. His lunch was prepared, as always, but left untouched on the sideboard cooling under its silver lid. By the early afternoon, unease spread through the household. Guards stationed outside his room shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the closed door but refusing to move. In the kitchens, cooks muttered that it was unnatural for Stalin to sleep so long, yet still no one dared to enter. His paranoia about the so-called doctor's plot was fresh in everyone's mind. If he were fine and they barged in, he might see it as a betrayal. The house, once filled with laughter and clinking glasses only a few hours earlier, was now smothered by dread. By mid-afternoon, it was clear to everyone in the dacha. Something was wrong. Hours slipped by. Food went untouched, and not a sound came from Stalin's chambers. Staff whispered, guards paced, but fear kept them from opening the door. By evening, the silence had become unbearable. Something was clearly wrong. It was close to 10:30 p.m. when the decision was finally made to act. Under the pretense of delivering mail, Stalin's guard Peter Lozgachev entered his private rooms. The dim light revealed a scene that froze him in his tracks. On the carpet lay Joseph Stalin, sprawled in his pajamas, his body twisted awkwardly. A dark stain spread beneath him where he had lost control, a haunting sign of helplessness from the man who had once ruled unchallenged. Lozgachev rushed to his side. Stalin was alive but barely. His breathing was ragged, his right arm and leg limp. An overturned glass and spilled mineral water on the floor suggested he had tried to rise and collapsed. Some accounts recall a faint groan, a slurred attempt at words, but his mouth hung slack, unable to form coherent sounds. The Generalissimo was paralyzed, felled not by an assassin's bullet, but by his own failing body. The guard called for help. Other staff rushed in, their faces pale as they lifted Stalin's heavy body and carried him to a sofa in the small dining room. They covered him with a rug, staring down at the man who had terrified an empire, now helpless and broken. The instinct was to summon doctors, but the memory of recent arrests froze them. Instead, calls went out to his lieutenants. Within the hour, Beria would arrive, his reaction as cold and calculating as ever. Shortly after midnight, the quiet of the dacha was broken by the arrival of black cars. Beria and Malenkov were the first to step inside, their coats heavy with the cold night air. They were led to the sofa where Stalin lay, his face swollen, his body limp, his breathing harsh. For a moment, Beria studied him closely. Then, with a dismissive wave, he declared, "The comrade is only sleeping." His words weren't comfort. They were command. The staff, desperate for direction, obeyed in silence. Beria's motives were never clear. Was it denial? Was it fear of calling doctors too soon and angering Stalin if he woke? Or was it something darker, a calculation that a dying Stalin was more useful than a recovering one? By 9 p.m., no panic, no word to the outside world. Malenkov nodded along, unwilling to oppose him. Soon after, Khrushchev and Bulganin arrived. They too stood over their leader, shaken by the sight of him reduced to a husk of the man who had ruled them for decades. Yet even they hesitated, caught between instinct and terror. Stalin's body snored and wheezed as if mocking them, alive yet unreachable. No one dared break the paralysis of indecision. The hours dragged. The four most powerful men in the Soviet Union sat in a guarded vigil, whispering in corners, avoiding each other's eyes. Outside, the birch forest was silent under fresh snow. Inside, the dictator lay unmoving, while those who had feared him most hesitated to save him. By 3 a.m., it was undeniable. Stalin would not simply wake. The question now was whether anyone would risk taking responsibility for his fate. By dawn, it was clear to everyone in the dacha that Stalin would not be waking on his own. His breathing remained uneven, his face swollen, his right side limp. The charade of calling it sleep could no longer hold. At 7 a.m., word was finally sent to the Ministry of Health, and a convoy of physicians was rushed through the snowy roads to Kuntsevo. The irony was not lost on anyone. Many of the very doctors now summoned had only narrowly escaped arrest weeks earlier. As they entered the dacha, their faces were pale with dread. To treat Stalin was to risk your life. If he recovered and was displeased, blame could fall on you. If he died, suspicion could just as easily do the same. When the examination began, the truth could no longer be denied. Stalin had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. His blood pressure was catastrophically high, his right arm and leg completely paralyzed. He did not respond to their voices or to light shone in his eyes. The dictator who once dominated every room was now silent, unreachable, and broken. The doctors set to work with the limited tools they had. Ice packs were laid across his head and chest to cool the fever. Leeches were applied behind his ears in an attempt to thin his blood and ease the strain on his heart. Adrenaline injections were prepared. Oxygen tanks wheeled in. Orders were given that Stalin was not to eat or be disturbed. His body remained slack, his pulse weak, his breaths a ragged rattle. By 10 a.m., his children had been summoned. Svetlana entered quietly and was stunned to see her father reduced to such fragility. She took his hand, warm but unresponsive, and realized that the man who had towered over her childhood was already slipping beyond reach. Around her, the Politburo members stood grimly in silence, watching their master's life hang in the balance, and already calculating the world after him. The days that followed were heavy with dread and silence. Stalin lingered in a deep coma, unresponsive to voices, touch, or the treatments applied. The dacha became a place of hushed footsteps and strained whispers, its atmosphere more like a mausoleum than the home of a living man. Doctors rotated at his bedside, recording numbers that only grew worse. Blood pressure spiking, heartbeat weakening, shallow breathing that rattled in his chest. The best medical minds the regime could gather worked in fear, knowing that every action might later be judged as sabotage or incompetence. Meanwhile, the members of the Politburo drifted in and out of the dacha, taking turns at his side but spending more time in private rooms, holding whispered conferences about the future. None dared speak openly of succession, yet the truth was clear. Stalin would never recover. The paralysis that had once gripped his enemies now paralyzed his allies. They waited, but they also prepared. Outside the compound, the Soviet people were still in the dark. It was not until March 4th that Radio Moscow finally addressed the nation. A trembling announcement admitted what could no longer be hidden. Their beloved leader had suffered a brain hemorrhage. The report assured listeners that doctors were fighting for him and that the party watched over him closely. Across the country, men and women wept openly, while others whispered in kitchens and back rooms, daring to wonder what life without Stalin might mean. Inside Kuntsevo, the truth was harsher. The dictator's condition worsened by the hour. His skin turned pale and waxen, his body heavy and unresponsive, his once commanding presence reduced to the faint rise and fall of his chest. By the night of March 4th, even the most loyal had to face it. Joseph Stalin, the man who had terrified an empire for decades, was slipping beyond reach. By the morning of March 5th, the vigil had turned grim. Stalin's condition, never good, now spiraled into agony. His breathing grew harsher with each passing hour. Doctors recorded a terrifying rise in blood pressure, injections and leeches proving useless against the collapse of his body. Family members and party officials gathered in shifts, standing in uneasy silence around the couch where the dictator clung to life. As evening fell, the atmosphere inside the dacha was suffocating. His daughter Svetlana sat quietly by his side, holding a hand that no longer responded to hers. Across the room, Beria and the others watched, their expressions unreadable, torn between the image of a dying man and the weight of what his death would mean for the Soviet Union. Shortly before 9:50 p.m., Stalin stirred. After days of silence, his eyes suddenly snapped open. Witnesses would never forget what they saw in them, a mixture of terror, rage, and something close to pleading. With immense effort, his left hand lifted from the couch, trembling as it rose toward the ceiling. Some said it was a final curse, others that it was a desperate reach for life itself. For one chilling moment, the room froze. Then just as suddenly the hand fell back, the rattle in his chest ended. The silence that followed was absolute. At 9:50 p.m. on March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the Generalissimo, the man who ruled the Soviet Union through fear for nearly 3 decades, was gone. In that instant, the balance of power shifted. For those present, there was shock, grief, and for some, quiet relief. Outside the dacha, the snow fell steadily on the darkened forest, covering the estate in silence. Inside, the reign of Joseph Stalin had ended, not with a roar of command, but with a dying gesture and a final, heavy breath. For a few minutes, no one moved. His closest lieutenants, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin, stood in silence, each man processing the enormity of what had just happened. Some later recalled tears, others only a cold calculation. Beria, in particular, reportedly allowed himself a smirk of relief, muttering that the nightmare was over. But relief had to be masked. For decades they had lived in his shadow, and now they would have to prove themselves worthy of leading without him. By midnight, plans were already in motion. The doctors recorded the official time of death, and the Politburo began drafting a public statement. Outside the dacha, the world remained unaware that the Soviet Union's supreme leader was gone. Guards maintained their posts, unaware of the frantic conversations unfolding inside. The following morning, March 6, 1953, Radio Moscow carried the news to the nation. The voice of the announcer was heavy with sorrow, declaring that Comrade Stalin had died the previous evening from a brain hemorrhage. The broadcast painted his death as the tragic loss of a great leader, emphasizing his tireless devotion to the party and the people. Across the Soviet Union, factories halted for moments of silence, workers wept, and entire cities stood still as the words sank in. For many, it was like losing a father. For others, it was liberation disguised as mourning. Almost immediately, preparations for a grand funeral began. Stalin's body was embalmed and laid in state at the Hall of Columns in Moscow. Thousands of citizens flooded the capital, desperate to glimpse their leader one last time. So many crowded into the streets that in the crush of the funeral procession, hundreds were trampled to death. The tragedy only deepened the aura of fear and grief surrounding his passing. Behind the scenes, power shifted swiftly. Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev positioned themselves as heirs, each maneuvering for dominance. Outwardly, they honored Stalin with speeches and processions. Inwardly, they worked to dismantle the machinery of terror he had built. Within days, the man whose word once decided life and death was reduced to memory, embalmed in Red Square, praised in state broadcasts, but already the subject of hushed debates about what his absence might mean for the future of the Soviet Union. The Iron Fist had finally stilled, but its shadow lingered long after the announcement echoed across the airwaves. Joseph Stalin was dead.